Or maybe not.
No, I'm here.
Oh, hi.
Thanks.
Hi, there you are,
Oh,
Ian.
Hi. I was just waiting patiently.
Thanks
to
to Flying
at least-
Spaghetti
We
Monster.
just now got you piped into us. So thanks for calling. What is your question?
Where do babies come from? No. So
Russell
I'm
won't
recent-
tell me, and I'm...
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah,
older,
yeah. You
Martin.
sound great. You sound great.
So I'm recently back in school, studying economics, and I'm.
They have human sexuality classes.
They
if
do,
you really
you're
want
right.
to know.
Russell, we are listening politely to Ian's question. and
Yes, we are.
Talk about that later. Yeah.
So I'm back in school, and I'm surrounded by, well, more proselytization than I'm used to.
Oh, goody.
Yeah, I know, right? So recently, I ran into, like, these people. I love a good pitch, so I walked out. Like, there's these people sitting outside, so I walked up.
Are we talking about street preachers right now?
Pretty much on campus.
Okay.
Yeah. But they were just like sitting with a board. I was like, oh, what's this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out they were Jehovah's Witness. And I was like, that's cool, man. I'm good. I'm just gonna, And they said, oh no, I want to talk to you about the thing. So I said, all right, you want to talk about it? And then I kind of laid out my kind of shut down the conversation argument, which basically goes like,
Never think your argument's going to shut down the conversation. Just telling you.
Yeah. Well, anyway, let's hear the...
Go ahead.
The story. Yeah.
All right, so God, Yahweh, explicitly cannot exist because for the New Testament Yahweh is from where all goodness comes. If it is a thing done by Yahweh, it is therefore good. Eternal reward or punishment for finite crimes is immoral, which usually works pretty well.
It does.
Well,
Okay.
if someone is not used to hearing that kind of argument, it could sort of befuddle them a little bit, and
That's
they'll have to
fine.
let me contact my pastor and get back to you on that sort of a thing.
Yeah, I think people in general are sort of unconsciously a little uncomfortable with the idea of hell, but they've managed to rationalize it in some way.
Well, I know that, for example, William Lane Craig's routine is that, yes, he accepts the first premise that you put forth, Ian, that God is the source from which all goodness comes. And then if the atheist decides to rebut with, but what about evil thing X, Y, and Z? The line is that God has moral justifications for doing those things. Not that it's up to Craig to say what those are, but suffice it to say that they're there, and God knows what they are, even if we don't, because He's smarter than us, and He declares Himself the victor of the argument at that point. And so, and that just kind of reminds me of Hume's line about arguing with people who have renounced the use of reason,
Right.
And being
Anyway, let him finish his story.
So
in presenting that, absolute or infinite reward or punishment either way for finite actions. All life on Earth is finite, so it did trip the person up a little bit. But he then came back with the idea that Jehovah's Witnesses don't either believe in heaven or hell, which was interesting, and that threw me for a loop. So then I had to go to my Old Testament rebuttal, which looks like...
I just want to say, this is why we start so many conversations with what do you believe and why do you believe it? Because you don't want to assume something about the person's belief and spend a lot of time arguing about something that they don't even think in the first place.
But
Anyway, note for the future.
Thank you. So that kind of threw me. So then I went to my Old Testament argument, which looks like it was immoral for God to punish Adam and Eve for eating of the tree of the difference between good and evil, because prior to them eating, they didn't know the difference between good and evil. And he says, oh, well, of course they did. It was like, but no, they couldn't have, because that was the transformation. They were naked before, and they didn't know their nakedness, and after they ate the fruit, then they discovered their nakedness. So there's clearly some kind of transformative cognitive thing going on, and to punish... You don't punish a 2-year-old for touching the stove. You care for them. You look after them and say, you shouldn't have done that. It was for your own good. But God explicitly punishes Adam and Eve. And then that one as well didn't go quite as I would like it to go. So those are my experiences.
What was their,
I was
what was
hoping
their
to have.
response to that?
Yeah.
What was their response? What did they say?
It was just basically that, of course, God is God, and God is in a moral position, and anything that he does is justified. It's like, well,
Okay,
no.
so Christ, they sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but clearly they couldn't have known the difference. So why would you? It's immoral to punish them. It's like, well, of course they knew the difference, because he had it in his head that God is the source of all goodness, and so he was justifying his predisposition as opposed to taking in what I had to say and actually like analyzing what the argument was. It was just like not dealing with that and just relying on what his definition of God was.
Well,
So I was hoping for your analysis, or maybe a better argument for, in particular, the Old Testament and how to refute kind of that version of Yahweh.
Actually, well, yeah. Do you want to go?
I tried to look on it from a story editor standpoint. It's why put the tree in the Garden of Eden at all then, right? If he didn't want them eating of the fruit of it, and if he had to have a tree which grew fruit that would magically make you distinguish, like why did God need a tree, right? Like why a tree? Why fruit? Why does eating fruit make a completely morally innocent person suddenly cognizant of the difference between good and evil? If God
what does
did not,
God need with a starship?
yeah, it's like if God, did not want Adam and Eve for whatever reason to comprehend the difference between good and evil and have the knowledge of that difference, why magic the fruit of this tree so that it would give whoever ate it that knowledge, and then explicitly tell them, it's like saying to your kids, you have a couple of 12-year-old boys, and you say, now don't look at my massive porn stash outside in the woodshed. Just don't, okay? It's a fucking amazing massive porn stash. There's like, anything you could imagine. There's, blow-up dolls. There's all kinds of, there's this guy doing a pumpkin. It's the most amazing porn stash you could ever imagine. Don't touch it. I'm referring to the porn stash in the woodshed, next to the tools, behind the tools, kind of to the left. That porn stash, yeah, with like the amazing thing with where everyone's in oil and rolling around in chocolate syrup, yeah.
Martin,
Don't look
I think
at that.
this is too much detail.
Well, I was just kind of warming up to the metaphor here, okay? But it's sort of like, yeah. So why tell them? Why tell them the tree was there at all? Why put the tree there? Why have the fruit of the tree able to do this thing? God created it all. So just none of it makes sense from the ground up, and
So clearly, I agree with you guys.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I got a different take.
Does it involve porn?
But
then I don't want to hear
no,
it. So
sorry, no porn for you today, Martin. I mean, first of all, I agree with both of you. It doesn't make sense. But you are dealing with somebody who starts with the assumption that it's gotta make sense, and then any kind of mental twisting and contorting that they can possibly do to justify it making sense, they're gonna do. It's like if you've ever tried to argue about continuity errors with a die-hard comic book fan. It's like, right? Like,
well, those are the people who really jump on the continuity errors, though, and then they angrily email the writers.
Like nobody ever told us Superman has the ability to pull off his S and make a cellophane net and throw at people. How does that make sense?
Red Hood is canon. It's canon.
Right. And when did he get the ability to teleport and make illusions out of himself? I have a grudge against Superman too. But anyway.
Let's not even get started on Man of Steel.
Right. I haven't seen it. Deliberately. I'm not that big a comics book nerd anyway, but it's like you are arguing about the internal literary merits of this story. You are trying to explain why the story doesn't make sense. And since it's all fiction, whether you're talking about Superman or the Bible, there are no rules. They can just come up with any thing that sounds halfway plausible and say that's the way it is because the premise is the Bible's definitely true about everything it says. So I don't play that game. I don't argue about details of the Bible. Whenever somebody throws a Bible verse at me, I'm like, huh, that's interesting, but I don't believe the Bible, so who cares?
Yeah, it's the Star Trek rule.
Yes, that is what I'm getting at. I just didn't want to say Star Trek again.
We can talk about porn some more.
How did that girl get that? Never mind.
What does God need with a Star Trek?
But I mean, the bottom line is there's no reason to believe any of this stuff. It doesn't make sense. It's not verified by science. The Bible was written by a bunch of people who were just trying to make sense out of the world, and the story is really not that good. So all you really have to say is, well, that's a cool story. I don't believe it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason why I engage, actually, is, well, for one, I want to frame an argument that makes kind of internal sense to the story as they are presenting it. But also, so Sam Harris relatively recently interviewed a granddaughter of Fred Phelps, and she was saying how she had a Twitter exchange with this Jewish guy pointing out the kind of internal inconsistency with what was being said, or was being preached at the Westboro Baptist Church, and that was like the seed that got her to change her mind and leave with her sister. So
I'm coming at this from a perspective of someone who never was religious. So maybe I don't have the full picture on what changes people's minds. But in my observation, you never change someone's mind immediately by going for Bible contradictions. You might plant a seed in the long term, sure.
Right, which is why I'm going for a logical inconsistency. Internally, that works narratively to the story presented, but is logically inconsistent. Like that's the how I'm trying to frame these arguments. And I think that the New Testament, my argument, works very, very well to someone that is like, oh, well, that's actually really, how does that work out? But
in the case of a Christian, they always have a trump card, which is, well, God is much, much smarter than us, so we don't have to understand it because he had his reasons. Yeah, that's always going to jump out of that argument.
Or they might go ahead and concede that a particular Bible story might, not adhere to some absolute strict rules of logic, but it doesn't really matter because there's a moral message or something that is being taught to us, and that's what we really should take out of it. So, every believer is different in a lot of ways, and so pointing out the illogic and the ridiculousness of the Garden of Eden story might work with one, where with another they would completely dismiss that and say, oh, well, I only take the Garden of Eden story metaphorically anyway. My reasons for believing are X, Y, Z. So because I've often talked about, like, my big inconsistency that I love to talk about are the 4 different resurrection stories from each of the 4 Gospels and how they're widely different accounts.
Look up Dan Barker's Easter Challenge. That's a good one.
I did the thing on the blog about 5 years ago where I talked about like the resurrection, where I said choose your own resurrection adventure, and even something like that. They'll say, but there may be differences, but they don't really matter. In aggregate, they all sort of tell the same story. And again, what you're supposed to get out of it is, I guess, just the sense of glory and majesty that God's kingdom on earth is coming.
It's all poetic and shit.
Et cetera, et cetera. So they have a way of, I guess it just all depends on, you need to find, it gets back to what do you believe and why do you believe it, and then sort of from what they feed back to you, build your arguments on a case-by-case basis and see where it gets you. At least in terms of, if nothing else, getting them to listen, even though you don't expect them to agree right away. They might say, well, I've never thought of that. And if you've done that, that's at least headway.
Yeah, that's really all I'm looking for is, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
But thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
right, thank you for